So, pretty much same answer across the board. What'd you say?
White-tailed deer.
White-tailed deer, and the behavior?
Buck rub.
Antler rubs, yep. Okay, cool. So, how do we distinguish, first of all, what else could it be, just as a group, things to put out, just to have on the radar? What other sign could mimic this?
Human, beaver, hogs.
Human, so like
Squirrel stripping.
equipment coming through, knocking off stuff like that. We could have beavers, perhaps, although there's very little cutting into the bark, so this would point towards smaller mammal doing some sort of cambium feeding. Although it's then what we would be looking at is, if you look at this, we could basically measure this, and they're almost identical all around in all these different strips, which would be very strange for a small mammal who would probably be girdling the entire tree or having interesting patterns of bark, patches here and there along strips. Cambium feeding of ungulate themselves, generally speaking, where they'll actually start that cutting with the incisors often a little bit higher, where it's easier. When we think about rubs, and this is one of the things that helps us differentiate between in landscapes where there's big mule deer and then elk, say. And when we think about rubs, generally speaking, when that's happening, if you think about when you watch bucks sparring or any of the antlered animals sparring, they're holding their heads down low very often, and it's this very violent shoving that happens down here, and they're getting a lot of that power by having their head low and getting a bunch of leverage off of their bodies. And so the rubs themselves tend to start a little bit lower so that they can have that ability, because well, I'll just say it this way. As opposed to sharp cutting like incisors, this is this slow abrasion away, so they need some push into it. Whereas a lot of times your cambium feeding, it can be low, but they don't have to have as much, and they'll scrape as far up as they can get to. On the whole, obviously there's lots of exceptions to this, but a lot of times what you'll see is if there's something that an ungulate is actually getting from the bark, they'll get as much of it off extract as many calories as they can from a good source. And they'll also be doing things like scraping up, and they call it spaghetti, and they'll grab a piece and then it strips off, and it'll tear strips up the tree and remove that way. This one is harder to tell. Ow, that has thorns on it. This one's harder to tell, but one of the things that we're looking for in abrasion is that there is shrapnel, so to speak, up on top as well as down, because there is energy being pushed up and pushed down. Whereas when they are feeding, you don't get this fray at the bottom because all the cutting action is going up the tree. Harder to tell in this. The other thing we can look at here is, like in this one in particular, you can actually see the cuts from the base of the antlers down below and up above too. So we're actually getting some of that slicing from the candle waxing at the base of the antlers.
So are they doing this to remove velvet, or are they doing it to exercise their necks?
Great question. So there's part of the myth of rubbing is that it was to remove velvet, which can happen, right? You can get some of that, you know, when you see antlers that have just hardened, so there's this whole hormonal change, stops antler growth. They basically die and harden. They've turned to bone, so to speak, but you've got all this bloody tissue hanging off that they'll eat very often. And as they dry out, they begin to polish them, and they can, because some of that stuff will stick, and there is some removal of that. But the primary function of rubbing is communicative. So what they're doing here is there's a few things happening. So they are grinding away, they are preparing a surface, and there's different kinds of rubbing action. There's thrashing, and but these, when you see surfaces prepared like this, they are grinding away and preparing a surface. And then there's a couple things. Whitetails have a lot more concentrated glands in the top of their head than some of your mule deer species. So they're doing a lot of top of the head rubbing. They also are doing the scrapes in many cases, and then just rubbing their lacrimal gland or the tops of the heads on twigs that hang over. But what's happening here is there is surface created, smearing it with hormone goo, basically. basically, and then reapplying it all over their antlers, and then walking around with these antennas that are broadcasting physicality, sexual status, health, whatever it is that they are communicating with each other, which is cool. And then everybody else is coming around and sniffing stuff too. But what I love about sign like this, that's right, bringing antlers down. But what's cool about some of this stuff, just a few fun facts about antlers. For many of your deer species, it pulls as many nutrients from the body for a mature buck to produce a set of antlers as it does for a doe to produce 2 fawns, which is pretty cool. Major energy, or major nutrient sap from the body, so a lot of bucks when they're growing good racks, they go osteoporotic, and a lot of it from their rib cage. And that's one of those things that's interesting and studied in that whole realm, because as soon as those antlers seal off, die, the body just floods back to full strength, which is pretty cool, full bone strength. There's all sorts of cool stuff that they've done with antlers. If you inject does with lots of testosterone stuff, they will sprout antler buds and do all kinds of things. A lot of times those the cactus bucks, the bucks with really strange growths and stuff, have lost a testicle either during sparring or on barbed wire or on sharp branches, whatever. So there's all these interesting things. There's also hermaphroditic animals quite a bit out there. You see them in elk somewhat frequently. I don't know about whitetails, but that's kind of cool because they never come out of velvet. They're usually just spikes, and the spikes can get larger, at least in elk. I don't know for whitetails. And so there's just all these cool things that antlers are expressing in the world. Yeah, so
there's another one with speaking of the growth, like if they injure a leg, it affects the growth of the opposite antler.
Cool.
Oh.
Yep, it is.
Where that crosses.